Hello and welcome back to the Analytics FC podcast. I'm your host Chris, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Nikos Overheul. So Nikos is somewhat of an expert when it comes to football scouting, strategy and recruitment. So much so that he spent time consulting with Champions League clubs around that very subject. So Nikos's last full-time role was with the Vancouver Whitecaps in the MLS, where he was the director of recruitment. So we speak a little bit about the intricacies that come with working within the MLS, but we also touch on some other previous roles that Nikos has held, such as his time at Statsbomb, but also where he was at both Brentford and FC Midtjylland in the early days under the ownership of Matthew Benham. We also speak a lot about risk and reward, and I put a hypothetical few questions to Nikos as the owner of a football club and get to see how Nikos thinks about going into a club and building out a squad for the future. So really interesting stuff. So without further ado, let's bring Nikos into the conversation. Nikos, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me, Chris.
No problem at all. So you are a sports executive with experience in football strategy, player recruitment and innovation management. We're hopefully going to get into a lot of them topics there. But what I'll do first off, Nick, is I want to pass it over to you just to give a brief overview for those that maybe don't know who you are.
All right. Yeah. So I am Nikos Overheul. As you said, I've worked in football for about a decade now. My first job in football proper was at Brentford and FC Midtjylland, of course, until recently had a joint owner. Before that, I worked more in writing tactical analyses and working in media. So that was sort of my background, and that led into working in football proper. Started at Brentford and Midtjylland, as I said, then moved into consultancy for an extended period. My most recent public job was director of recruitment at the Vancouver Whitecaps in MLS, which I left about 18 months ago, roughly. And since then, I've been working as a consultant again.
Yeah, perfect. So we'll start with the Brentford in the early days then, Niko. So that was sort of nearly 10 years ago, maybe? I think you said you'd been involved. Is that around 10 years ago that you...
Yeah, I think the season was 15-16.
15-16, okay. So coming on a decade then. So I just want to ask you a little bit more about what you kind of got up to there, because that was kind of, they're often seen as a pioneer within, at least, I know they were partnered with the Midtjylland in terms of, but in English football, in terms of how they went about things. How were you kind of getting... what kind of things were you doing then, and how do you look back at that now to see where Brentford are in the Premier League now and how much success they've had?
Yeah, so basically my job was as part of a four-man football analytics team. Of course, as you know, Brentford, Matthew Benham, the owner of Brentford, has a very extensive history in professional gambling, and was one of the first, along with his former business partner, Tony Bloom, who owns Brighton, one of the first to really leverage statistics in the use of gambling. And basically, as Matthew became more and more involved in the actual running of Brentford, he started to leverage the knowledge and the insight that his data team had collected into actual football strategy. But of course, to do that, you need people who can translate, those insights into actual recruitment decisions, things of that nature. So Ted Knudsen and myself were two of the people who were part of that team that led that department. This is around the same time that Phil Giles, who is now still the director of football at Brentford, was installed in that particular role. So we were basically part of the team that helped with scouting and recruiting, and that did a lot of work on set pieces, as did I. And we also helped a little bit with related things. So we have, for instance, you want the coach to exhibit particular behavior. For instance, how do you structure bonus clauses in a contract that will sort of stimulate the behavior that you want the coach to have?
Yeah, definitely. That's interesting, because I had that down to ask you about the kind of bonus and how you kind of align the goals and kind of do that, because it was on my podcast, but I spoke to Mark Warburton, who was head coach. I don't know if he was there when you were there, but he also mentioned a similar thing in terms of bonuses as well. Yeah.
So Mark actually left around the time that I joined. There was a lot of organizational upheaval around that time. This is when Ted was brought in full time.
Yeah.
And Ted then asked me to join full time as well after I had done some freelance scouting for him.
Yeah. Yeah. And you mentioned you used the word kind of translate a second ago, Niko. So, because see, as you're going in, you've got the ownership team. You mentioned Matt Benham is obviously very data driven, and the guys, you and Ted Knudsen and stuff like that. But what about the other members of the kind of coaching team? Was it hard at first to kind of get the message across in terms of what the club was looking to do in terms of, when I say other staff, I mean like just coaches, academy coaches, scouts, and maybe less so data oriented?
Yeah, I mean, well, the scouts, basically, that was part of why I was hired. There weren't a lot of scouts anymore because, again, because of the organizational upheaval. That at some point, basically, apparently told the executive leadership, like, we do need actual people to like evaluate the players. That is still required on some level, and that was why I was brought in. Like, we did not necessarily have a lot of contact with the coaches. A little bit more at Midtjylland than we did at Brentford. Because of course, like, Midtjylland basically won the league the first year that Matthew really was involved, so there you immediately get a lot of buy-in. So basically the key thing that you have to do, and this is not like a Brentford or Midtjylland thing, just a general comment, is like the fundamental nature of a football club is that it is about football. So you don't talk in like data terms, you talk in football terms. That's like the entire gambit. Because like you cannot reasonably expect people who don't have a data background to learn the language of like programmers and computer scientists so that they can do their job. Like they were here first. So that's like, they are the fundamental people for like a football organization, and you have to translate everything into their language. And to be clear, like, I am also the type of person, like, I'm not a computer scientist, so I also need things explained to me sometimes. So I've been on both sides of that.
Interesting. So one thing you mentioned that you and both Ted as well did it whilst at Brentford was around set pieces as well. So I'm just taking a look at this from your LinkedIn profile, Niko. So you've listed there kind of building set piece processes and around set piece theory. So can you just kind of riff a little bit on how you integrated data into those things there in terms of the theory of set pieces, etc.?
Well, a very obvious one was that we looked at which teams were particularly good at specific types of set pieces. That's just a data question. Like, out of 100 corners that a team takes, how many of them result in chances, et cetera, and how good are those chances? So that's the starting point of a deeper analysis, and then you can do actual video analysis. Like, okay, so they're good. What is it that makes them good? And is that replicable for our teams? Because of course it also ties into like player personnel, et cetera. So that was basically the starting point. Like, identify teams that are good at the things that we want to do, and then look at how they go about doing that and replicating that.
So, I mean, can we go a little bit deeper, Nikos, in terms of what makes a good set piece kind of strategy? You mentioned it kind of comes down to your personnel in terms of who you've got in your squad currently, but is it, I'm trying to break down in terms of the delivery, but also like the zones that you are kind of attacking into, then the players that the marking style, the zonal man-to-mark, man marking, etc. So I'm just trying to get a grasp on
that makes sense.
What makes a good set play, really.
I mean, basically, again, this is also a statistical sort of problem. Like, what are the positions or the places in the penalty box that are particularly valuable? And get your players there. Attack those zones. And that's like, okay, so if we know that, how do we go about getting people open in the most valuable zones? Where do second balls land? Because of course you don't have to score with the initial attempt, you can also score later. Famously, this is what Sam Allardyce did at Bolton as well, and he called that POMO, position of maximum opportunity. Again, those are just data questions, like, where is the ball likely to end up? Where is it most valuable? We should be there. And then, of course, like, those are the basic principles, and then you start to implement that based on the personnel that you have available.
Definitely. So I want to speak to you specifically about kind of working as a consultant as well, Nico. So you did that after Brentford. You're doing that currently now as well with different clubs. I know we won't be able to kind of name specific clubs, but I was just trying to gauge a little bit more in terms of how that kind of works with clubs, in terms of the pros and cons of working as a consultant with clubs in that kind of domain, and how that kind of works. Are you going into kind of as a fresh pair of eyes to an existing department? Are you going into clubs potentially that don't have a department and you're kind of there instead of that? So just to paint the picture a little bit around the kind of consultancy aspect, if you can.
Right. I've done both of those things, actually. Obviously, that's probably going to depend on what the level is of the club that you're at. I've worked in like a football league team lower down that didn't really have a scouting department. This was like shortly after after a takeover, different owner. And we temporarily took over like a scouting department, so get it up and running, and then hand it over to the people who are going to be there long term. That could be an example. Like that could be a situation where the owner wants to maybe go into a slightly new direction, but the people on the ground don't really know how to do that.
Yeah.
So you temporarily take it over, so show them the ropes a little bit maybe, and then let them get on with it. That could be one. Like my most recent bigger project was with a club in the Champions League group stage, where I was essentially sort of a full-time role, really, where I was partially sort of head of the scouting department in a sort of unofficial capacity, as they were bridging the gap to like newer people coming in.
Yeah.
And then I moved into sort of a recruitment strategy role. So like really sort of game out, like, okay, this is our squad, these are our organizational goals. What does that mean for how we want to build out the squad over the next 12 to 18 months?
Yeah.
Like go like, if we sell this player, what do we replace him with in terms of like age profile, skill level, things of that nature.
Yeah. So you mentioned the last one there was kind of pretty much a full-time role there. So would that typically be how you prefer it to be, Nikos, in terms of rather than freelancing with, say, a couple of clubs at the same time, would it be more intense and more full-on and require more time?
I think both are interesting, both setups. Like obviously there are teams that you would work at in like a freelance, like case by case structure that would not be interesting enough to work at in a longer period full time.
Yeah.
And like one of the benefits of working with more and more teams, or as opposed to like a single one, is that you get a good perspective on like how other teams do things. I've always found that those periods where you work with more teams, you tend to learn a little bit quicker, like in terms of your own development, because you get to experience more clubs and more club cultures, more leadership styles, and then you can sort of reflect on that as well.
Yeah, because I figured you were obviously after Brentford did a bit of freelancing and then consulting, and then you were at Statsbomb. So I presume when you were there, you were kind of working. Well, obviously you were seeing lots of data on lots of different players and kind of consulting potentially with different teams. So I suppose it goes back to that from a personal perspective. You're kind of learning how clubs operate, how clubs like to do things, but you're getting different perspectives. Would that be a fair assumption of kind of what you got up to at Statsbomb? Because that was it like kind of a technical a technical scouting role at Statsbomb?
Yeah, so Statsbomb, of course, was primarily a data company, but also had a consultancy side, which was also used to like strengthen the connections with some of the customers, obviously. That didn't scale as well, but that's like it sort of improves, like I said, the relationships with existing customers, and also proves that you as a data company have actual experience working in sport. So we would advise certain clubs on all sorts of things, really. Like that could be head coach, like the way that would work wasn't like, oh, we need a head coach, please give us one. It'd be like, hey, here are 3 candidates for our head coach vacancy. What do you think?
Okay. Yeah.
It could be like a second opinion on a player. If there's like some doubt within an organization about like, is this player a good fit for us? How much should we pay for him? And we could sort of benchmark that a little bit, things of that nature.
Yeah, interesting. So after then, you mentioned Vancouver Whitecaps. So how did that come about, Nikos, that role? And because you went in there, did you start initially as a consultant with them and then director of recruitment? How did that look?
Yeah, that was more of a sort of a contract structure. Because obviously you can imagine going from Europe to Canada, the work permit can take a little bit of time, and they still wanted me to do the actual work already, but I couldn't work in an official capacity yet, so I didn't have the permit. So that was a consultancy structure initially, and then I moved into that role in like the proper sense. The way that worked was that Axel Schuster, who was at that time sporting director and became sporting director and CEO, basically in the process, while I was in the process of being hired. He sent me a long email, and at some point in that email, he said that he wanted to convince me to join, which is very flattering. And that was very convincing. And I talked with him a couple of times, and of course, it took a little bit of more time than we would have wanted because of COVID. Particularly MLS was harder hit than most leagues. Particularly, as you can imagine, the Canadian teams, because no team could actually come and visit. You can't play home games if every visiting team has to quarantine for 2 weeks. So they were all in the US. So yeah, that's what I joined because I thought the process, so the project was very interesting. It's clear that Ox had a carte blanche essentially to restructure the organization as he saw fit. And he in turn gave me a lot of freedom to structure the recruitment and scouting department in the same way.
Yeah. Okay. Can you describe what the kind of that scouting and recruitment team looked like in terms of other personnel that was in there, in terms of different roles that maybe you brought in after yourself or were already in place? How much was of a change? How much of a project was it, Nikos, for you going in there to make those changes?
Right. So Vancouver has or had and still has a very good analytics team led by Johan Wind, who's very good.
Mm.
And so they were already in place. They were working on things, but they weren't really really being leveraged in terms of scouting and recruitment. So in a way, it was sort of the same situation as Brentford, where there was already a lot of expertise that was not being used well.
Okay. Yeah.
So that was part of it. One of the people who's also been with Vancouver for a long time was Dave Deere, who was literally the first ever employee of MLS.
Okay.
So way back in the mid 90s. So when the first lists of players for all the MLS teams were being created, Dave was the person creating it.
Yeah, nice.
And literally the first ever employee of Major League Soccer. So he was also part of our organization. And of course, that is a person that has incredible connections in like college soccer, in like older MLS people. And that's, of course, a person that you really want in your organization because he has a lot of knowledge about MLS in particular, which obviously I had less of because I'd not worked in MLS. I'd done some consultancy for MLS teams, but I never worked in MLS proper. So that expertise was very valuable.
Yeah. Yeah, that was definitely a thing I wanted to speak about in terms of the things that come specific to the MLS in terms of like the salary caps and the different, rules in terms of bringing players in. So was that a big learning curve for you? And kind of also, can you talk a little bit around what those actually are to the people listening that might not understand that in terms of building your squad and the different constraints that you have to contend with?
Right. Okay. Like the problem with talking about this is that you never know how much detail you need to give in terms of the salary rules, but I'll try.
Yeah.
So for me, like I'm a big fan of like basketball, so I'm used to the notion of like salary caps and like how rosters are constructed using that.
Yeah.
So that helps, I think, a lot. But of course, you still need to know the actual details of MLS in particular. But like I'll give you an example. Like every team has the exact same amount of money that they can spend.
Yeah.
And then there are three players, designated players. For instance, Lionel Messi now, and Christian Benteke. You can pay those whatever you want. Yeah. Like if you pay them 10 million or 2 million, they still only count for approximately 650 in the salary cap.
Are there any rules on that? Sorry to interrupt, Nick. In terms of the income of the clubs, so say Messi, for example, I don't know how much he's getting paid, but I imagine it's quite a lot. So is there a cap to how much the club would be allowed to pay, even on these ones outside of these designated players? Does it matter how much the club is bringing in income, or can the club? It doesn't matter at all. Okay.
No, if the owner wants to bankroll that, he can.
Okay, right, yeah.
So that's the situation, and of course, Vancouver is not one of the richest teams, and also not in terms of like location, one of the more attractive teams. That's not a knock on Vancouver. Like in basically every North American sport, there are essentially 3 cities that players want to go to really badly, which is New York, Los Angeles, and Miami.
Yeah.
And then there's like smaller teams like Atlanta, smaller cities like Atlanta. But Vancouver is not on that list, even though it's a very beautiful city.
Yeah.
But of course, like that also matters. Like for instance, you can look at the rosters in like LAFC right now. They have Olivier Giroud and Hugo Lloris. Like those players are there because it's in LA.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So
they wouldn't go to Kansas.
Yeah, I see. Okay. So, and in terms of then the managing that kind of salary cap, is that something that you would probably have to take into consideration, or is that a GM thing? Is that would there be a specific salary cap analyst, or someone that purely manages that? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, that is actually like often a specialized role.
Right.
Like actually knowing, it's like basically a mix between like a head of scouting or head of recruitment and like an accountant.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
And obviously that's also often a data-driven thing, like actually mapping out, okay, how much can we spend there? And if we do this, how does that change moves that we can make elsewhere? And there's also like minimum and maximum salaries for like homegrowns.
Yeah, okay.
And I'll give you an example. So we acquired Sebastian Berhalter, son of Greg, the former U.S. men's national team coach. And Seb was a homegrown player from Columbus. So he came from the academy of Columbus Crew. And like, again, what I mentioned about the details that they need to give, like there's a lot of detail there is about to come right now. So the homegrown status is attached to a player. It is not attached to the club. So when you trade for Sebastian Berhalter, he also becomes a homegrown player for you.
Okay.
So he was at the point that we acquired him, he was now a homegrown player for the Vancouver Whitecaps, even though it was the first time he'd ever been in Canada.
Yeah.
But then you have something that's called the homegrown subsidy, which means that that's like just an accounting number that you can apply to the salary of a player that has the homegrown status. And that means that his salary counts for less.
Okay.
And that made Berhalter a more attractive proposition because we didn't have a lot of homegrown players who could actually play.
Yeah.
So we were paying him, I don't know, let's say 120, I don't know, but he would actually count for 70, which made it so that he could take on a different type of roster designation.
Yeah.
So it's like things of that you have to think about. Like, do we want to actually get a homegrown player from another team as opposed to just a regular player? Because that means maybe, we can actually do some cap mechanics. That means that we can do other things that would not be possible if it was just a regular player.
Yeah.
So these are the types of things that you need to think about. And as you can see, like you get in the weeds very, very quickly.
Yeah, definitely.
And as you can also immediately recognize that why this is a specialized job.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned kind of homegrown and kind of younger players. I just want to ask you a little bit about how the draft system works over there as well, because this, again, I have no clue really about this. So, I'm also into the way things work in the UK, but can you just touch a little bit on how the draft works and how maybe you utilize that at Vancouver as well?
Yeah, so as in every North American sports, the college draft is a part of the sort of roster construction strategy. It is, as you can imagine, not as important for soccer teams as it is for baseball or basketball. It is probably the most labor-intensive part of the job as a director of recruitment, or at least the scouting department as a whole, because as you can imagine, there's not a lot of data, and it doesn't really mean a lot because it's also the difference in quality is very big. And like basically, broadly speaking, the best that you can hope for, with some exceptions, is that you get like a rotation player, a guy who can maybe start for you sometimes. That's already a good outcome. Like you can get really like starter level players. Like famously, Duncan McGuire was linked to Blackburn. That didn't go through for unclear reasons, but he was also a draft pick, did really well in 1 year, and was basically got like a $3 million valuation roughly. So it's still possible to get like genuinely good players, but that's not the expectation. So that's roughly where we're at in terms of the draft.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So then, I mean, another thing would be kind of the lack of relegation and things like that. I'll presume from a kind of goal setting and long-term planning, that probably helps things. You haven't got to worry about things like, again, going back to the UK, kind of losing status in the league and stuff like that. So how do you think about that? And does that make things easier, Nikos, for yourself?
It can, and like in strategically healthy clubs, it does, because as you say, like there's no, like you can't just quote unquote sacrifice the short term. Like let's say you're a bad team right now, and you want to, and your actual goal is to be a contender. You can't say, okay, this is a 3-year path that we're taking, and we don't really care about what happens in year 1. Like we're just going to play our kids, we're going to develop them, and then in year 2 and year 3, we're going to see if we can really make a leap towards contention. This is, in a way, what we did in Vancouver. So my first year in Vancouver, the first season was 2021. Vancouver in 2020 was one of the worst rosters that's ever been assembled in MLS, saved only by really good goalkeeping that made it look a little better than it was. So yeah, like if that's your goal, like if that's your starting point, you can't go, we're just gonna try and storm the playoffs right now. No, you're too far removed from that. So you need to take intermediate steps. And that allows you to be more patient with decisions. Like, you don't have to rush into really like making big transfers, because to do what exactly?
Yeah.
To get like 3 or 4 more points, and then what happens if you get 4 more points?
Yeah.
You're still not where you need to be, and it doesn't matter if you get 4 fewer points because there is no relegation. But again, of course, this depends on like having internal conversations with the owner, and also being honest about things like that to your fans, like that we are here to build a long-term healthy organization. We are not going to rush into making quick decisions. And a really good example of what we did is like, it was very clear that Vancouver needed to sign an attacking midfielder or 10, and we didn't do it in the first window.
Okay.
Because we couldn't find like the right deal for the right player, and we waited until the summer, and we got Ryan Gold, who was the best player that Vancouver has ever seen.
Yeah.
But like, if you are in a rush, you cannot wait. If, like, for instance, we were at risk of relegation, we probably would have signed like a lesser option in January.
Yeah.
But if that risk doesn't exist, you can take a more long-term view. Should say that a lot of teams still don't take the long-term view, but you can do that, and you probably should.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just kind of that balance, but also kind of going back to aligning the whole club, because, you know, someone like yourself, in terms of kind of whether it's be a head of recruitment or a sporting director, is probably there for a longer term, or has a bit more security than a head coach. In some cases, you know, the head coach might be thinking, well, this is all well and good, but I could be sacked if we don't, you know. Maybe it's a little bit different in the MLS, but, you know, the pressure is a hell of a lot different to them, and they might then become a little bit more, you know, unsure of the process. It might be a 3-year plan, but for them, they might not probably be here in 3 years. So how do you think about that, Nikos, in terms of balancing that between the different personnel within the club?
Yeah, I think that is one of the primary sources of contention in the club. That's actually not a problem. I think that's very healthy. Because, of course, like, even if you're my head coach and I'm your sporting director, we have the exact same beliefs and the exact same information. Like, we're going to come to different conclusions based on the fact that you are trying to win the next 3 games and I'm trying to win the next 3 years.
Yeah.
But like, I think what is very important is, again, like, communicating to everyone, including your head coach, like, what you're doing here. And again, like, if you make clear to the head coach, listen, this is our long-term strategy. You are essentially one of the department heads who was tasked with executing the strategy. You are, of course, the most important one and the best compensated one. Yeah. But still, you are in charge of executing the strategy. Like, we don't want you to play, for instance, veterans that will be out of contract and won't be here next year. We would prefer you to play the kids. And of course, if you ask the head coach to do that, you do actually have to make sure that he understands, like, hey, you're not getting fired for bad results. That's okay, but we don't care about bad results. And of course, that is sometimes a hard sales pitch, because I mean, they're right. Like, it's also, even if they're not at your club, their record might be worse if they play kids, and that may hurt them later in their career.
Yeah, that's definitely, I suppose it also matters as well if this whole change, if you've inherited a coach from before, you know, because that coach is probably then going to be a bit more worried about, am I the right fit for this new kind of regime and thing like that. But if you've used the data and you've brought him in as part of the direction, then I can see that would be a lot more safer for the coach, and he'll probably feel a bit more comfortable at that point. So what I'd like to do, Nikos, if we can, so I want to kind of give you let's say I am the owner of a club, and I'm going to go to the UK because I know that a bit more. So a championship club in the UK. So I have a lot of money, and I want to improve my scouting recruitment department, and I want to bring you in, Niko. So can you just kind of talk around some of the first things you will be thinking of, you know, assessing when you're thinking about coming to this club? Because I presume that would be an important thing for you to think about as well, is in terms of choosing the project as well, because, you know, it might be well and good that I'm going to offer you a lot of money, but if I'm not going to then give you the things that you need in terms of to do your job, you know, I presume that you'd want to pick a scenario which will help you flourish and be able to, you know, achieve the goals easy. So just a few of the things you'd think about if I was to give you a call and say, Nikos, I've got a championship club, we want to start moving up the league and increase or improve our recruitment. What kind of things would you be thinking?
So first of all, I would have an honest conversation with you about what it is that you actually want. This can be difficult sometimes because every team in the championship wants to get promoted.
Yeah.
They'll all say that.
Yeah.
But is that actually the most important thing, or is the most important thing that you don't want to lose, say, more than £5 million a year? Can be. That's, by the way, that's not a criticism. Because that's a lot of money. But like, are you going to be more angry with me if we don't get promoted, or if I lose more than 5 million? That's like the very because that the actual most important thing is there is a hard limit to how much money we can lose.
Yeah.
And that, like, to be very honest about that with each other and also to yourself is very important. That's how you start. And it's like, okay, well, let's say you mentioned in the scenario you have a lot of money. Congratulations, by the way. Okay, so I'm assuming here, like, there is no limit to spending, except for the regulatory.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, so that's a question like, what is the nature of the club? Like, what is the history? Is there a specific type of football that we like historically? Do we recruit from specific types of leagues historically? To just give you an example, like you recruit differently for Millwall than you do for Norwich.
Yeah.
Both are equally acceptable, but they're different, and you have to adjust based on like the culture of the club that you're going to work for.
Yeah.
And again, like so we have essentially infinite money. And I ask you, is there something that you as an owner like? That could be like style. Maybe you want a more defensive team.
Yeah.
Like I've had owners who really, really like defensive-minded football. And that's fine again because like it's your money. If that's what you want, you're going to build like that. And it's also very important to talk through potential points of contention. So like it can be, for instance, that you say, listen, I like a lot of defensive football, and also I want to develop young players. And then I tell you that might be difficult because like young players are going to make mistakes, particularly if they're playing in defense. They will cost you games.
Yeah.
So that's a risk that you have to accept. Like it basically has to be one or the other. Really like be honest about the trade-offs in terms of the strategy that you want. I've always found that is a difficult thing for a lot of people. For instance, like I've had situations where there was like a list of 20 leagues that we were going to cover in terms of scouting. Those were the priority leagues. And then, of course, players from other leagues you're going to miss because that's what it means to have a priority. Yeah. And then those people would get upset that we didn't have players from the other leagues. It's like, no, that you made the decision to do that.
Yeah.
And that is the trade-off. And that goes for like more top-level stuff as well. Like, what is it that you want? Talk through the trade-offs for that and like really be honest about that. And then at some point we will have a clear idea about, okay, how much money do we have? What type of playing style do we want? Do we want to sell players? Do we want immediate results? What is our timeline? And all of those, if all of those are clear, like what is that we want? And then we go to step 2, which is how do we go about achieving all of those? Which again is influenced by the factors that I mentioned earlier, club culture, etc. And I thought, okay, what leagues do we like? Okay, if we like, for instance, Scandinavia a lot, maybe I look at a specific scout who's very well versed in that region, who has a lot of connections, who knows the young talented players maybe a little bit earlier. Again, like how much risk do we want to take is another very important question.
Yeah, definitely. Let's kind of add to the example then, Niko. So let's say that the club that we're talking about here is traditionally one that is kind of old school long ball football, but I don't want that. I want to totally change that up in terms of how the style of play is. But currently the squad isn't really suited to the new style. So how, would it be a case of, is that just a gradual thing into, because I'd imagine that would be a hell of a big change to say we're going from this to this. Is it more of a, let's see what we've got and let's make small adjustments to try and get slowly towards the end goal, or kind of rip the band-aid off and say, right, let's quickly, do you know what I'm trying to say in terms of big change?
Yeah, so how do you sort of manage that change? Yeah, so it sort of depends maybe on what the current level of the team is. Like, if you rip the band-aid off, are you going to survive? Like, are you going to get relegated, yes or no? If the answer is no, you should probably just do it.
Yeah.
It's something that like Matthew Benham has also talked about in terms of like enforcing types of behavior. You want to make essentially like unreasonable asks of the people that are already there, because people are very heavily incentivized to keep doing what they're doing. And there's always a reason not to do something. Like, oh, I don't want to change that style because this, and this. Okay, but you still have to do it.
Yeah.
And so I think if you try to do a gradual change in an organization, that is likely to be somewhat resistant to it because you're changing everything they've ever done. I think you should be very harsh. Again, provided that that doesn't lead to catastrophic results. Yeah, so I'm very much in favor of really pushing the strategy that you want. I would maybe advise you to not change it.
Okay.
But if you are committed to changing it, that's, I think, how you should do.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So, and then in terms of then more granular on the actual deep. So, let's say you're coming in as sporting director, Niko. So, what kind of people would you want in your team in that scouting department? Like to whether that's data personnel, whether it's scouts. Kind of how would you like to organise your department in this made-up championship club that I own?
Yeah. Again, it depends a little bit on like what we're doing in terms of strategy. Like I said, the example that I gave, for instance, for the Scandinavian scout, that could be one.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, I would definitely want like an initial check of like the important players based on key performance indicators. So you start with, okay, this is how we want to play. These are the types of players that we need per position to do that, and this is how we find them.
Yeah.
And that is how I would start. And then, of course, if you go by that, like the first like stop is, okay, how do we find those players? That is a data question, I think, in the first instance. And then like, what are the characteristics that we are looking for and how do we best measure them? I would leave that up to the data personnel. That's their domain. And then, you want like scouts who take a closer look at those players and also look at the background and have good connections with agents in leagues or regions that are relevant to our recruitment strategy.
Yeah.
That's really how I think about most things. Like you do step by step, like what is it that we actually want? How do we go about achieving that? And what do we need to achieve it? Yeah. So that type of logic basically just applies basically every question that you're going to ask me. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, definitely. So okay. So one of the questions then, Nikos, would be our team, let's say, is not scoring enough goals. So how do you think about that from a data and scouting point of view? If that is the problem, we're not scoring enough goals. What's the kind of solution? And
okay, so first of all, obviously you drill down. It's like, why don't we score enough goals? It could be that the striker is very bad, but that's probably not the reason.
Yeah.
It could be like, okay, so then you really drill down, like, what is it that is preventing us from scoring the amount of goals that we want? Is the striker just really bad? That's one. Are we not getting the ball at the good areas?
Yeah.
That could be one. Are we not progressing the ball through midfield enough so that we do have players who are good enough in terms of chance creation, but they don't get on the ball enough?
Yeah.
That could be one. Do we not win the ball in midfield enough so that we just spend too much time defending? And that in terms of the time that we have the ball, we're actually okay, but that time is just too short.
Yeah.
Again, it's really just a matter of like, what is the actual problem that we're solving? And again, that is a data question. That is a data and a performance analysis question. So you sit with the coaches, you sit with the analytics team, the performance analysts, like, what is it that we're trying to solve actually? And then the question is like, okay, we have identified a problem. What do we actually need to fix that problem? It could literally just be like I said, that the actual solution to our overall problem of we don't score enough goals is we need a better ball winner in midfield.
Yeah.
It could be because we don't generate enough transition opportunities. And that's something that we're good at. Well, we don't get enough of them. That could be the issue.
Yeah.
This was something that actually happened in Vancouver. So like we had a coach who was very good at defensive organization, but the actual personnel just didn't win the ball. So we had a very good defensive team in terms of like defending against set offense. But we would spend just inordinate amount of times in that defensive structure because no one ever won the ball.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what's your thoughts on kind of, and this is different because different countries and different leagues have different playing styles, but, it seems to me as more so a fan really, Nikos, than anything, that a lot of teams are now, playing very similar, in terms of styles of play. Do you ever think about the pools of players that people are looking at? Like, there's people looking in the same pools, basically, in terms of it's very crowded and they're looking for the same thing. So does that make it harder then from someone like from your perspective in terms of bringing these players in if just more teams are just looking at the same thing?
I mean, if everyone is looking at the same thing and you don't have enough money to compete with them, you by definition have to change because you can never win.
Yes,
Famously, like in Belgium, Union Saint-Gilles, who are also owned by Tony Bloom, are a very good example of that. So they play essentially very heavy transition football, but not in terms of like the Red Bull style, more like long ball, fight for the second ball.
Yeah.
And of course, like if you know what you want to do very clearly, you can start to identify players that can help you play that way. So they very clearly have an idea about what they want from players in every position, and they then don't care that those players have obvious weaknesses.
Yeah.
Because like, what does it matter if a player has a certain weakness if you're not going to play in a style that will play to those weaknesses?
Yeah.
Like if you're going to play for the second ball a lot, it doesn't matter if your starting center forward has a good first touch.
Yeah.
Because you're not gonna want him to control the ball. He's just gonna knock it back into midfield and then you press. So again, there's a lot of benefit to sort of essentially playing a countercultural style.
Yeah.
And sort of continually developing that style as well.
Interesting. So, and more still on the kind of data side, because I want to ask you about the kind of communication of data in terms of whether that be convincing non-data personnel within the club, because I'm sure you probably agree in terms of you could have the best data and models that ever, but if you've not got the people in place that want to take that on board, or if you can't get your messages across to them types of people, then that's a problem. So how do you feel that potentially data personnel can increase their communication skills when it comes to from data to non-data personnel?
I would say again, like really think about how you can translate things into football language. And for most people, this is not actual problem. This is essentially a solved problem for, I would say, most data personnel.
Yeah.
Really. The second problem is then, do the people listening take it on board? If it's well communicated or not, that's a secondary problem.
Yeah.
But yeah, the central thing is again, like, what is the shared language in a football organization? It's football. It's not data. So it goes back to what we mentioned at the start of the chat, which is that like you have to translate things into language that is used by the people that you're trying to convince.
Yeah, because we all know kind of data can be used to kind of fit a certain narrative, and it's about kind of removing the bias. But like you said, they might take it on board, but they might not then action. They might be a bit reluctant to action. I don't know if you've got any experience of kind of clubs seemingly wanting to take data on board, but then maybe not so, or maybe experiences where they've not taken the data on board correctly, or how you would have envisaged them to. I don't know if you've got any experiences you can share with that, Nikos.
Well, I mean, the very obvious problem sometimes, as you mentioned, that data can be used to support any kind of narrative, really. If you look hard enough, you can find evidence of everything, really. And it's definitely been the case that like people would come. This is also a consultancy problem that we have, by the way, that people would come to us and literally ask us, hey, we're going to do this thing. Do you have numbers that support us?
To back that. So they've already made the decision, basically.
And this literally got to the point where like people came back to us after we had written a fairly negative report. Like, no. Listen, we don't want a negative report. We want a positive report. Can you please make this report more positive? It's like, I don't think this is a healthy organization. This seems maybe not the way to do things.
Yeah, well, that's just like I say, they've already made their mind up. They're just wanting something to back that. But again, that's just a total waste of money to use you guys in terms of consulting on that. But yeah, that's interesting that you've shared that example. So let's kind of go to again, we've touched on it a little bit already, but kind of risk and reward. Just going back probably to the Brentford days, you mentioned the gambling background of Matt Benham and stuff like that. So how do you think about risk and reward, Nikos, in your kind of recruitment style?
Again, like this is something that you have to discuss with your owner, because really it's often about money. And again, but also in terms of like if we're talking championship, it could be relegation.
Yeah.
Are you willing to accept a higher chance of relegation if it means that you can really kick on in 2 years.
Yeah.
For instance, that could be a risk that you also a risk tolerance. A fun financial example that Christopher Flanagan, who's a sports lawyer, wrote about in relation to the Diarra case.
Yeah.
So there's now a lot of uncertainty how future transfers will look, what the transfer market will look like in 2 to 3 years as this thing sort of rolls out. And a lot of people say that things are going to change very dramatically, and a lot of other people say with equal amounts of certainty that it will be a very marginal thing. So the only thing that you can really know as an executive is that there's a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And uncertainty means risk. And one of the scenarios that is in play is that transfer fees will depress. They will decrease. And of course, that the very obvious result of that will be that sell-on percentages will become less valuable, potentially.
Yeah.
So you want more initial payment and a lower sell-on fee or lower sell-on percentage. Equally then, buying teams will be more willing to give out sell-on percentages because they are less valuable.
Yeah.
Now you can then say, okay, we as a club actually are in a good financial situation. We are able and willing to take on risk as a selling team. So what we will do is we will structure them in the old way. Relatively lower initial payments with a higher sell-on fee, because there is a risk that they will become less valuable, but we don't know for sure. And they'll be more, the buying teams are more willing to give them out. So we can ask for more than we initially would. So that could be an example of like, okay, we are taking the risk that we will get less money in total, but the potential upside is that we get more money than our potential competitors.
Yeah.
That could be an example of things that you can think about.
Yeah.
And again, like in MLS, again, like I mentioned, we should have signed. That was the expectation that we would sign an attacking midfielder. We didn't do it because we were happy to wait for a sort of a bigger payoff in the end. The risk of that is that you piss off your fans. Which is an entirely legitimate response from those fans. But again, like you have to think about like what is it that you want to achieve? What is the type of risk that you're comfortable with? Again, this can only happen really if you're very clear about your organization goals and your strategy. And again, like if you don't have a lot of money, the risk has to come from somewhere. You have to, like, I'll give you an example, like in terms of a head coach appointment. If you don't have a lot of money, like every team wants a head coach that is good and that people know is good. But if a head coach relative to your level, if everyone knows he's good and you're like a bottom 5 team in terms of finances, you will not be able to afford a coach that is good and is known to be good. So then you have 2 things. Either you know the level or he's an unknown. And the only way that you can get a really good coach is if he's unknown. But because he's unknown, that is a risk. It's things like that. So it's like really about like, okay, what is the downside that you're comfortable with? That can be financial, that can be again like risk of relegation. But again, it depends on like what is your actual goal. Do you want to get promoted as a smaller team that doesn't have a lot of money? You have to take risks because otherwise you'll never achieve it.
Yeah, that's interesting. On the kind of hiring of coaches, so I presume when you're looking for a coach to hire using data and things like that, you would be looking at what they've done previously. Because all I'm trying to say here is like your example was perfect there in terms of a coach. Say if we're a club of the Championship and we've identified a coach that fits the kind of style that we want, but they're in the National League, that's a bit of a risk to bring them up 3 or 4 leagues. And it's just about kind of managing that risk. And maybe it's a case of we wouldn't take that risk. We'll kind of monitor that coach and see where he goes next and see. But obviously by then he would be more expensive and more people will know about him.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Perfect. So let's kind of go to the role of the academy then as well. So we kind of, again, we're in this Championship example, so we're not on the MLS and we're the draft in terms of there. So how do you think about the academy? And again, I know a lot of these answers, and rightly so, are coming down to what are the goals of the club? What do you want to achieve? We need to align towards them goals. So in terms of the actual academy and how, the role that can play in this kind of structure of a club, how do you think about the academy, Nikos, and kind of organising that to have a nice what's the word I'm looking for? conveyor belt of players coming through if that was one of the goals of this team?
Yeah, so I think an important thing is that you have sort of alignment throughout the academy in terms of playing style. So that again, this goes into like certain teams consider their first team to effectively be the oldest academy team.
Yeah.
And that is an approach that I like. Again, you can't do it at every team. Like famously, FC Nordsjælland in Denmark does that very well. And I think that is a very good approach. Like to really think about, okay, because if you are going to get players that have to do specific things in your style of play, it helps obviously a lot if they've already been in that system for 7 to 8 years.
Yeah.
And of course, this is not viable for every team, particularly in the UK. In England, the system is very heavily tilted towards the bigger teams. But like you can still do it. They're still like for basically at every level, they're relatively lower paid players because like it will be their first contract.
Yeah.
You know exactly what type of people they are. They've been in your organization already.
Yeah.
So ideal that there's less risk there.
Yeah.
But of course, you have to be prepared for them to make mistakes. And again, this is something that is often difficult also for fans. Like fans love nothing more than like local kids coming through the academy.
Yeah.
But those same fans will want him out of the team if he makes 2 mistakes that cost you a game.
Yeah, true.
But like again, this is a matter of commitment to a certain strategy. It's like, listen, this is what you want. You want the local kids to come through, and they will cost us games, and that's fine. We accept that. And if fans start to complain, the head coach or the sporting director or the CEO or whoever will go out and say, no, we accept this. This is what we want to do. And if they cost us games, that's fine.
Yeah, definitely. Perfect. Well, that's basically everything I wanted to ask you, Nikos. I want to finish on kind of, we spoke about goals before, but I want to ask you about your personal goals. So what, I presume you want to move towards this kind of, from the consultancy to a sporting director, but I may be wrong. What's your...
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, sporting director, assistant sporting director, like director of recruitment if the role is interesting enough. And honestly, the more I work in football, it becomes, I think, less about like working at the highest level, although that's still nice, of course. But more about like working with people that I enjoy working with.
Yeah.
That is very important to me, and like location is of secondary importance. Like I would go anywhere to work with people that I like.
Yeah.
So that could be either like if I'm an assistant sporting director, I need to trust the sporting director. Or on some level, if I'm the sporting director, I get at least a little bit of freedom to hire people that I think are good.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I said, like this to me is the most important thing, that you get to be a part of a project that is enjoyable to work in, that has some ambition. And where that is, like I'd rather work at a lower level, but with better people than at a higher level. Yeah. Like that's something that's become very clear to me basically over the last couple of years.
Yeah, definitely. And obviously where you can make an impact as well. The environment is key, isn't it? So definitely. So Nikos, I really appreciate your time. That's a very, very insightful conversation. Thank you very much for that. Where can people find you? Are you online if people want to learn more, reach out to you?
I am still on Twitter, not very active. I am also on Blue Sky, but it's just my name, Nikos Overheul, just one name. And Overheul, actually, just my first initial and my last name. And I'm also on LinkedIn. If you just Google me, that's probably going to be the first result.
Yeah.
I shouldn't be too hard to find.
Perfect. Nice one. Well, Nikos, have a great day, and thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, sir.
So that's been the Analytics FC podcast. So thanks again for joining us. So if you have enjoyed this episode, please do like, follow, subscribe, and we'll be back next month with another podcast with Analytics FC. Bye for now.